Well, I trust everyone has enjoyed a little coffee break, and I welcome you back to this session this morning. And this session is going to be about the Governor's Aviation Development Task Force report and the findings and recommendations. And we're going to be hearing today from John Lennon and Secretary of Transportation, Nick Tennyson. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about Nick Tennyson, our Secretary of Transportation. He's been our Secretary since August of 2015. And prior to assuming his role as Secretary, Secretary Tennyson served as the department's Chief Deputy Secretary, responsible for providing oversight and integration across all operational and support functions of NCDOT. He also served for 3 months as the Interim Commissioner of the Division of Motor Vehicles. Secretary Tennyson is the former mayor of Durham, a role he held from 1997 to 2001. And during that time, he co-founded the Metropolitan Coalition of Mayors with Governor Pat McCrory, and I know our mayor from Burlington was very much involved with that. And while serving as mayor, Secretary Tennyson was vice chair of the Metropolitan Planning Organization for his region, which provided him the opportunity to learn about NCDOT and federal transportation planning process. Secretary Tennyson has also served as an officer in the Navy before beginning a career as a home builder and developer. In the late 1980s, he transitioned to work with trade associations such as the Greater Durham Chamber of Commerce. And prior to joining NCDOT, he was Executive Vice President for the Home Builders Association of Durham, Orange, and Chatham counties. And he holds a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Duke and a Master of Arts in Human Resources Management from Pepperdine. And also with us today, we have John Lennon. And John was from Washington, D.C., and came to America and joined us. We're glad to have you in North Carolina. But John, his work experience and background has been in real estate management and asset management. And he has quite a portfolio of apartments and commercial properties from coast to coast. And he did relocate here to Wilmington, his wife's hometown, in 1999. And he helped run several real estate firms and started his own commercial real estate firm in 2003. In 2005, started another firm called Ocean Crest. It provides consulting services to the community and regional banks for special assets needs. His community activities include he served on the Mayor's Convention Center Task Force for 3 years, served at New Hanover County Airport Authority for 8 years, and he currently serves on the North Carolina Board of Transportation. He was appointed by Governor to do that, and he also serves on the North Carolina Ports Authority. And he's on our Aviation Task Force as our chairman. That's why we're going to be hearing from him today. He's been there since 2014 and appointed by the governor to do that. Also, he serves on the Global Transport Board of Trustees. Also, he's Board of Trustees for the First Baptist Church in Wilmington. Cub Scout leader, coach-assisted Pop Warner football teams and home basketball teams, so forth. Glad to have both of you here today. I'm going to give the floor to Secretary Tennyson.
So is this supposed to be an accurate time? I'm just trying to tell here. Then that'd be good. I really ought to only speak places where I can see the time because some hope I'll stop when I'm supposed to. Then, and this comment about moving here from Washington D.C. to the United States. Dave Barry. Does anybody remember Dave Barry, writer out of Miami? I heard him speak one time, and he said, "I moved to Miami from the United States in 1982." And I thought that was hilarious. And then he followed that with that his recollection of the best motto that he'd ever heard from a Convention and Visitors Bureau was one that at least he claimed the Miami Convention and Visitors Bureau used, which was, "Come back to Miami. We weren't shooting at you." And I thought that was a pretty good approach to it. So it's tax day today. For context of my talk, could I have a show of hands of those people in the audience who would like to be able to pay more in taxes? Could I? Maybe I've got one. Okay, good. I'm glad to have there's somebody here. You can send that in as a donation. But fundamentally, the challenge we've got is the provision of public services, and those services being defined as those services we all agree that we want to fund. And I have to tell you that from my own limited experience in government, as mayor of the city for 4 years and now in an appointed position, the single most frustrating thing for me to hear from people is something about what the government ought to do. People say the government ought to do this, the government. You really, as soon as you start thinking of government as a third person, you've lost. Because the government is what we ought to do, what I ought to do, what I think we should spend my money on. And that's really the context for the challenge that's faced, at least I think, in the broadest description of life in America today, is getting some sort of consensus around what the definition of necessary is. Necessary, at least in the road business, would be those roads I have to use every day. Everything else is sort of a nice to have. I mean, I personally, the roads I have to use every day. So we need to have a system. We always need to have a system. And that's functionally the challenge for transportation generally, and that is we need to have a system. We need to have not just interstates. South Carolina's been trying that model. It's worked in some respects, but eventually you need to be able to get to people's houses. You need to have secondary roads. You need to be able to move freight on rail, and then you need to move it on trucks, and then you need to get it on airports or seaports. And you need to be able to connect those things. And you need to be able to do it in a way that people don't have to come up with a lot of unique solutions in their lives to be able to utilize the service you provide. And so that sort of seamless, overarching system approach is particularly challenging in the context of everything except what I use every day is waste. And I have to tell you, there are people for whom that is the litmus test. If I don't use it every day, I don't understand why we should pay for it. So the opportunity to be here today is particularly valuable to me because I believe in associations. You heard in my bio, I've worked for associations for a long time. I believe in the necessity of gathering people together to think about things that don't immediately necessarily benefit them. And that's the purpose of an association, is to be, in my view, a long-term way to think about challenges, whatever they may be. And the question of gathering as an association so you can learn from colleagues about how they've dealt with issues, you can share with people on those occasions when you're willing to how you've dealt with issues. You can get together to advocate for positions that are valuable to you generally. May not be of benefit to you in that specific moment, but at some future time will be. And that kind of a colleague, that kind of a partner for government is critical, because you must have people who are looking at things more broadly than single project, single quarter, whatever approach that people take on their individual businesses. You have to have a broader, and you have to have a longer lasting partner, because we in the bureaucracy deal with timetables, deal with all the challenges we have, and we need somebody who's actually working with us and understanding some of those things and can help us think through solutions that we may not be able to see. So associations are important, partnerships important. They write notes from these things, and somebody has a bigger ego than I do about this. And by the way, it didn't hurt my feelings that the immediately preceding speaker was talking about how do you identify a con artist, and I am actually the Secretary of Transportation. I just wanted you to know that, no matter how shocked you are as you learn it. But in any case, when we get into this, we get these notes, and so as you'll recall, is the note they put in, and none of you recall this. I was in Asheville when the Aviation Task Force was announced, when the governor had signed that executive order to create the task force, and he was very proud of the fact that was well received among the folks in this group, And I hope that once we are working our way through the report and trying to make sure that we get some of the things done that were identified, that we'll all be satisfied with the results. But I can tell you that as somebody who benefits from and uses community airports frequently as a result of my service as secretary, traveling around the state, I appreciate the work you've done to make sure that you've provided those facilities, because for your citizens, your users, and for those of us that have to visit areas, I'm going this afternoon to Concord to speak to a group there, and it would not be possible were we not to have the airports that we've got. Yeah. This is, did Richard Walls send this up, or is this just from you? This is the reminder to stop talking about roads, because you put a mile of road, you can only go a mile. Put a mile of airport runway, there he is back there celebrating the fact that he put in a mile of runway, you can go around the world. So, thank you, Richard. In any case, so I appreciate the fact that we've had these airfields to use. I appreciate the work that Bobby Walston does on a daily basis with his team at the Division of Aviation to make sure that we're good partners. I would like us to be good partners. On those occasions when we're not, we'd like to work to improve. And the Aviation Development Task Force, led by Dan and John and all the other folks that were on that group, I appreciate the work you've done. I also want to point out one of the folks who's here today is Karen Collette. Karen will wave now. Okay, there's Karen Collette. Karen is a Division III division engineer, and in that capacity, she is a person who should be engaged in all aspects of transportation. And I hope that when you get back to wherever your home place is, that you make sure that you know and have built a relationship with the NCDOT division engineer, and in particular with the metropolitan planning organizations and rural planning organizations that are a key to the planning of transportation, again, as a system. So those are groups that I think sometimes have either overlooked aviation or been overlooked by aviation, or mutually overlook each other, and to our detriment. We need to be engaged as a system and try to make sure we're solving these problems. Governor McCrory has consistently, I think, shown great foresight in terms of the planning and the expectations he has for the state. We have, as luck would have it, we have the challenges of growth. These are all upside problems. Every problem that we have is a problem that's created by the fact that we are a state with great attraction for folks from outside the state. And that includes the problems of those parts of our state which are not growing as rapidly, because they are finding themselves in a challenge where that whole cycle, the whole cycle of reinvigoration and growth of your community revolves around being able to offer opportunities for folks, not to think up ways that people can succeed. I think we make a mistake when we decide that we're going to centrally plan the economy and know which sector is going to thrive. But the idea of making the communities all be potentially successful is certainly the concept behind the Strategic Transportation Initiatives Act that changed the way we fund transportation in the state and give local communities a much greater role in understanding which priorities they want to have money spent on. When I was on the Metropolitan Planning Organization in Durham, they'd come in and they would say, you've got $80 million, whatever big number it was, $100 million, to allocate. We've already allocated it for you to I-40 and I-85. If you have any other projects you'd like to carry out, just tell us about them. We don't have any money to do them, but we'll sit here and listen to you talk about them, and that's it. And that's not the way it is anymore. Now we have a baseline score, objectively scored, and at the statewide level of projects, that's the score. That's the order in which we program projects. At the regional level, 30% of the input comes from local priorities. At the division level, which there are 14 divisions in the state of North Carolina, 30% of our budget goes to 30% of our transportation construction budget goes to the division level projects, which are equally allocated across the state, and 50% of the decision making in those is from the local level, and that can include both projects that are on airports with limitations and projects that would benefit airports. And so you should be engaged in those groups that are allocating those points, owes points. The other thing about this task force, which, as I say, I think was a demonstration of Governor McCrory's commitment to trying to plan things to solve the problems that we have, which are these upside problems, but problems nonetheless, is the 25-year vision he put out for transportation and was emblematic or symptomatic of his approach to the problem, which is until you have told people what your vision is, what you think you want to do, you cannot ask them to come up with ways to pay for that vision. And I think that that's, at least in my view, that's one of the major contributions of this report, is to begin to say, here is what we're doing, here is what we need to do, here is the reason why this is worthy of investment. Now, the whole concept of government is not something that is for the weak at heart. You have got to have stamina to be involved in government. Again, it is all of us together, and it takes a while for all of us to get together. So when you're engaged in these public processes, please don't enter these thinking that you get to show up at one meeting, get a vote, and walk out with a check. And that appears to be the approach a lot of people take, at least in my experience. And then when that isn't the way that it works, they get mad and or sometimes fall asleep in the middle of the meeting. So you have to be able to be willing to be committed to being in the process and seeing it to the end. We have a couple of representatives, or two senators, I guess, and a representative who will be speaking later, and naturally you should pay a lot more attention to what they say than I say, but this is not a case where you are the only priority the state has. You all knew that. Transportation, generally, is extraordinarily well funded in North Carolina compared to other states. We have been, and most recently, the General Assembly has recognized that even as well funded as we are, given the fact that the federal government doesn't seem to understand the effects over time of a growing population and growing number of vehicles and all the other things that are going on in terms of how they're approaching the federal portions of the infrastructure challenge. Our state has been incredibly foresighted in being able to put these funds out there, but it still is such a disconnect between the demand and the need, and especially when you include in the demand what is possible demand as opposed to just what's actual demand. And that's the possibility, this mile of highway that can get you anywhere around the world, that if we put it in as a runway, that's completely possibility thinking, or almost completely, because it's not like you've got a traffic jam somewhere that people experience for the most part on a daily basis like they do in their commute. And so being able to communicate that possibility gets to be particularly challenging. Now, the airport task force has done a great job in documenting the current economic impact. We have had some things about the budget that have been very positive. But the most recent budget was at $38 million for aviation, was the largest that's ever come out of the state highway funding. I have to share with you that the source of that funding, coming out of money that's raised for motor fuels tax for the most part, or licenses on automobiles, there are people out there in the world who think of their traffic jam as more important than any highway that's built as a runway. So all of these things are wrapped up in the same going forward possibility. And I want to also point out that Bobby and I and all the members of the Board of Transportation have had several opportunities to remind each other and be reminded about the critical importance of carefully administering those funds and maintaining the trust that we've developed from the people of North Carolina, and in particular the elected representatives that make the decisions about where those funds will go. If we don't do a good job of delivering, if we are perceived as not being careful about the way those funds are allocated and then how those projects are executed, ultimately things will get tough. These recommendations that are made are I think will serve as a good starting point. I don't believe that this is anything, again, that's going to be fodder for this immediate short session. I think that it's time to start getting people to be aware of this issue and generally be talking about it. I think with luck, it will actually be something that can be a long session discussion item and may serve to bring some resolution. We are, again, as a state, with transportation, education, healthcare, all of these things are all issues that the elected representatives of our state and all the states are dealing with, and we need to make sure that while we are aggressive and affirmative in our approach to advocating for our needs, that we don't get in the position of forgetting that there are actually other things that the public has agreed that we all need. Government, we need to do. So I look forward to working with the governor, continuing to work with the governor, and with the resources of the state and with the folks on the task force and all those others who are interested in making sure that aviation remains a priority, and it is a priority certainly for the McCrory administration, and I think for North Carolina as a whole. Thank you.
Two years has just flown by. If you didn't get one of these, it's out there. Before we start, I would like these people to stand up. Steve Bright, Dan Danley, Mike Langdith, Gary Louder, John Tawes, Bobby Walston, and Julie Wilsey. These people served on the task force and did a phenomenal job. And I also, where is Julie Hunkins? She's somewhere. There she is. She made my 13 pages produced in my kitchen table look really good. So thank you all very much. And I did not forget Dr. Finley. Where is Daniel, too? He produced all the numbers from it. There he is. Okay. Yes, thank you. So we started this process 2 years ago, and never in my wildest dreams did I think that 20 people committed to aviation and to airports would have such a diversity of opinions. But I was wrong. But it's okay. It turned out we all took our charge very seriously, that the only limitation was really our imagination. And we wanted to figure out what we had, what we needed, and then how to get there. A couple things happened along the way. The long session of the legislature, politics, all of those things. And you begin to realize that where you want to get to is not something that happens overnight. It's a process. And you'll hear me talk about that. But what we did try and stay true to was coming up with what we thought would be some of the best ideas and systems to build on what is already a phenomenal airport system in our state. I don't want to steal the thunder. There'll be a lot of numbers that will come out at lunchtime, but that's a starting point. We need to grow from there. One of the things that I will tell you that is always frustrating to me is people talk about wanting to go out in the middle of nowhere and build an auto plant or a manufacturing plant. Well, there's 72 airports with 85% of the infrastructure already in the ground. That's a pretty good place to start to build jobs. Okay, so enough about that. We had 4 basic groups. We had funding, economic development, military retention, and process. And we broke into 4 groups. We met 7 or 8 times. And I just realized, did I call Kevin Baker's name out? I did not. Okay. That's bad because he hosted us for lunch 3 times. Sorry. See, that's why I knew I shouldn't name names. But we had the 4 groups, and we started out meeting with those individual groups and really sort of honing in on each one. The Secretary touched on the fact that the aviation budget heretofore has primarily come from the highway fund, and that creates obviously a problem. One of the things that we started looking at on the economic development side and the funding side is the realization and the affirmation that the airport system in our state is a producer. It is a producer of tax revenue, and you will hear about some of those numbers today. The majority of those funds historically have gone into the general fund. And so as we started breaking things down, I'll give you a great example. Everybody's favorite topic was the fuel sales tax. We started looking at trying to quantify it. Well, guess what? We can tell you how many gallons of fuel get pumped. We can't tell you how many dollars in taxes got paid. Until recently, new legislation has been put forth that now the Department of Revenue is tracking fuel sales. So although commercial carriers and freight carriers are now exempt, the taxes collected are being tracked. So we will know, and that money by legislation now goes to the Department of Transportation and subsequently to the Division of Aviation. So that was, I think, a big win that we had midstream to at least be able to track those numbers. But it sort of showed not a problem with government, but a reality that to achieve what we wanted to, we really had to dive into the system to help figure that out. So getting to some of the major recommendations that were in here, one of the things that Dr. Finley helped identify, taxes earned, sales tax revenue earned, what I call inside the fence, and that's not entirely appropriate, but basically generated by business operations at the airport equate to $44 million a year. And that's broken into retail sales tax, fuel sales tax for non-commercial, et cetera. Why is that important? Well, it's important because the other thing that was identified through the systems plan was an $82 million void. I'm looking at you to make sure that's the right number. So, but an $82 million void. And this is really important, and this is really critical that you take this out of the report. The $82 million void is not to go build new terminals or extend runways or to do capital projects that we all want to do or economic development projects. That's to take care of what we have today, what you all have at your airports. The system plan identified that need, and looking at current funding and looking at that need, there's a big gap, $82 million worth. So looking at the fact that airports were producers, we looked at revenue generated within the system. Our argument was, should ideally stay in the system and be reinvested. The word reinvestment was used over and over and over, Kevin and Mike in particular, and that it makes a lot of sense. The other thing we looked at in terms of funding was there are a number of Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties that struggle to meet their match on grant requests. And that's a problem because back to what I said about where if you've got all that infrastructure in an airport and you can create an opportunity for jobs and additional tax revenue, but you can't scrape together the funds for a matching grant program, you're losing an opportunity. So we thought it very important to look to a solution for that for those Tier 1 and Tier 2 counties because 30 jobs in a Tier 1 county is a big deal, and it should be remembered. The other thing we looked at was I talked about the infrastructure on the airport, sales tax. One of the members brought up a really good point near the end of our work, a recent legislation on sales tax on labor created an issue for some of our MRO operations within the state. And one of our recommendations is to look hard at the impact that sales tax on labor may have on the MRO industry. My recollection is that the MRO industry in our state is somewhere in the $440 million, I believe, in output that they do. So that was a really important thing to look at because as somebody said, if you're getting ready to do a $40,000 overhaul on an engine, what's flying another 20 minutes to South Carolina? So let's have them land here. Another one of our recommendations has to do on the economic development side was to really become far more active than we are. We discovered a lot of little things throughout this process, like attendance at air shows from a variety of different departments and divisions across the state with not a lot of coordination. We believe strongly that the Economic Development Partnership should embed someone within the Division of Aviation permanently, to be a permanent advocate and business development expert for aviation in North Carolina. And that is, we met with them and talked to them, but there are tremendous opportunities out there in the aviation business, but we need somebody to pursue them full time. Military side, it was sort of twofold. So one, we actually discovered that North Carolina does a great job retaining military personnel and recognizing the sacrifice that military personnel make. We also discovered that military aviators aren't leaving the military. And so, but one of the other things that we looked at was the military's contribution to our airports across the state. One of the things that I learned through this process is that every airport is somehow touched by military operations in our state. And there are varying degrees of that. But that's something that we should continue to embrace, to work closely with the Department of Defense on, and recognize opportunities where a program may not fit into a federal funding bucket or a state funding bucket, but at the end of the day, it might make sense. How do we look at that? How do we make that work if it creates jobs and opportunity and military retention? General Cornell Wilson, who's now a cabinet member with the governor's administration, was very active in that part of our review and discussion, and we had really good feedback on various programs that are described in the report that we may want to expand on. The state has an awesome community college system. Again, there are a number of schools around the state that have educational programs. We believe that the need for them to collaborate and communicate and work together will make us stronger as a state. They each individually have wonderful programs that do good things, but together we could do really great things. When looking at trying to bring someone in, a large aircraft manufacturer or aerospace company. So we think that's very important. One of the big things that we came away with years ago, there was something called the Aeronautics Council. And we believe that an aviation commission should be reinstituted. And we say so in the report. One of the things that we learned through this process was that aviation, much as any other area of government or any other business sector, needs an advocate and needs an advocate body. And we believe that the commission would serve that purpose, that would serve to communicate with the airports, with government, and to potentially do a lot of things in terms of helping the Department of Transportation prioritize and keep its pulse on a very important sector of our economy. So that's described in the report. And then the other thing, and you'll hear me talk a little bit more about this afternoon, is training, period. You heard in my bio, when I was in the banking consulting business, the North Carolina Banking Commission has this phenomenal thing called a director's college. If any of you have ever served on a local bank board, you go for 2 days, unfortunately to Chapel Hill instead of Raleigh, but you go for 2 days and get locked up and you learn what it means to be a bank director. And you'll hear me say some more of this afternoon, but that's important. If you serve on an airport authority or if you're involved in the operation of an airport, we should be providing resources to you to do the best job you can do. And so that's another recommendation that came in. So one of the things that I would say in wrapping up before we go to questions, this was the easy part. We don't have any authority. We don't have any power. We don't have anything other than the ability to produce this document for decision makers and policymakers to review and ask questions about. And one of the greatest benefits of this report, I hope, is that aviation will stay in the conversation. We'll stay in that conversation for when we go through the next budget cycle. But the real work is getting ready to start right now, and it involves all of you. It involves all of you going back home, talking to your representatives, talking to your senators on a state and federal level. One of our groups went up to D.C. and got told flat out, your funding from the FAA don't rely on it for all of your needs in the future. What is the state of North Carolina doing? So you need to go back and talk to your local representatives, your state senators, and your local governments about the need to invest and continue investing in aviation. The beauty of this with legislators is you're not lobbying, you're educating. Because all you're doing is talking about what's happening every day out at the airfield. All you're doing is talking about how that one jet represents 10 homes and doesn't require any county services because you've already got them right there on your airfield. So educate them, spend time with them. We are a producer and we can produce more. So I think with that, I'll open it up for questions.
We have time for a few questions from the floor. Are there any? Don't be bashful. Yes, sir. Do you need a mic?
I'm Bob Lloyd, and I'm Commissioner of Cape Fear Regional Jetport. But one of the things, I've been in aviation all my life, and I have a great concern about the oncoming pilot shortage that we have to come in. Just to be a co-pilot on a regional jet right now, you have to have 1,500 hours. That's about $200,000. And that's almost unattainable for most people, and I think that's an issue that we all need to be concerned about.
Comments on the shortage of pilots and the future of that. Wow. I don't think we really did a lot of study on that other than the military retainage.
I think one of the problems is also what that first officer is making in that regional jet, which is why the military pilots are not leaving the military. And so that was one of the things we discovered. And I don't pretend to have the answer for that. I think the industry as a whole is very concerned about it. And our commercial airports are certainly sensitive to that because of the commercial carriers being aware of it.
Any more questions? Don't be bashful. Okay. We have a couple of gifts for our speakers.
Thank you.
Again, thank you both for being here and sharing with us. We look forward to hearing more during the lunch session, which begins at 11:45. So join us next door for lunch at 11:45. Thank you.